Hi, this is Jackie Williams, and today I want to discuss with you a few tips and tricks on using your Stampin' Up! Die cutting machine. I'm excited to share with you today a few tips and tricks on using the Stampin' Up! Die cutting and embossing machine, which is new or newish on the market. And so there are a few things that you might not know. Now, even if you don't own one of these yet, you may be using them in some of your classes. So it's a good idea to know how they work, and hopefully this is helpful for people. So first thing to know is on the bottom of the machine, you have these 4 little pads that grip. Now it does depend on what the machine is sitting on how well it grips. I found it works the best on a glass surface or a very smooth or shiny hard surface. So that's something to consider when placing your machine for use. And then of course we've got the 2 beds that will lay down flat as you use them, and it can be set up to be right-handed or left-handed just by turning it around. Now I also want to explain, before we get into some of the different ways to use it, that underneath here, underneath the handle or the top bit, there's a roller. You can reach under there and feel it. So it's important that you sort of know that, because you don't want to have any of your tools or your papers or anything going right up against those rollers. So that will be important as I explain things later on. I did have once somebody put a die right on the top without anything on top, and it actually went up into the rollers and wrapped around the roller. So that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. First, let's go over cutting. So you see up here with the cutting plates in the corners, you have 1, 2, and 3. So for standard die cutting, you need plates 1, 2, and 3, and 2 of plates 3. So this is your base plate, the very thick white one. And this one is a thinner shim to create the right thickness for die cutting. And you'll notice that it says right on these plates where I've highlighted, this is not a cutting surface. So we don't cut on these. These are just to create the right thickness in this machine. Now these 2 clear acrylic plates labeled number 3, these are your cutting plates. So you need 1 on the bottom and 1 on the top. 1 on the bottom is what you're cutting on. That's where the blades are going to face. And then the top one protects your tools and paper from the rollers. So you do need 2. It's a good idea to keep 1 as always your top plate. That way it always stays clean, so that there's no transfer of ink or bits of paper or color or anything onto the top of your paper or whatever you are cutting. It's also a good idea to periodically flip them around, because as they are going through the machine, it's quite high pressure. So eventually they will kind of start bowing. But if you keep flipping them over, then that bowing is definitely minimized. And that goes for the top plate as well. So I also want to discuss briefly the dies themselves. So this open die, where it's just like an outline, is called a framelit, like a frame. And this one, where it's very detailed and there's lots of intricacies, is called a thinlet. And they're just very slightly different in how you might manage them. So let's cut a framelit. So you're going to put the paper down first, and then the die in with the blades, which are these ridges that you can feel, but they aren't actually sharp to your touch. You're going to put that down against the paper so that it cuts the paper, and then you roll it through. And you might hear from time to time some crackling, and that's perfectly normal. You're not doing anything wrong. And then this will just pull right out of your paper and beautifully cut. Now it will leave an impression on your mat or your cutting surface. You haven't done anything wrong. That's perfectly normal. Now there is no need to run it through twice. All you're doing then is just using the blades twice, and therefore shortening the life of your dies. So unless it is a difficult die or it's not cutting properly, don't run them through twice or even 3 times. Now the exception then are these thinlets. Because they are so intricate, sometimes you do need to run them through twice. But I find that if you're having a lot of trouble with your thinlets, that either the paper is too thick or you need new plates, because your plates will compress and become thinner over time. But I do recommend that you run it through once and just check. And if it's cut perfectly fine, then only run it through once. If you're finding that it's not cutting well, then try running it through twice and or refreshing your cutting plates. Again, running it through twice is really just more wear and tear on your dies that may not actually be necessary. Now let's go on to embossing. So for embossing, needs plates 1 and plates 4. Now, this thin plate that we use for die cutting, it says right here on the plate, do not use with embossing folders. So you can set that one aside. That one is only for cutting. So you only need the base plate and the top gray plate for embossing. Now I am showing you how to use them with the newer Stampin' Up! Folders. If you have some older ones that are varying thicknesses, you will have a slightly different sandwich, but we're not going to go over that in this video. Now, as I mentioned before, you never want to have your folders or your dies or your paper against these rollers. Therefore, you're going to put your folder against the base plate and the gray folder is going to go on top. Now, I understand that that doesn't feel entirely intuitive because then you can't see, your product, but that is how it goes. So you're going to slip your cardstock inside of your folder, put the gray plate on top, and then run it through. I also want to point out that the seam of your folder, so the hinge side, always goes first. We've had it happen in varying events and classes that if you run it through where the open end goes first, sometimes you will get kind of like a little air pocket, and by the time it's gone through the very high pressure of the machine and gets to the seam, the embossing folder actually kind of explodes and splits into two. So we don't want that. So always goes seam first. And absolutely never go back and forth for exactly the same reason. Well, 2 reasons. One, it's entirely unnecessary. It's not going to emboss any more or less if you run it through once or twice. And the other reason is if you put it through and then run it through again, you're essentially putting it through backwards. And again, you're putting your seam at risk, and we don't want that. So you should get a very nice impression just running it through one time. So I hope those tips and that information was very useful to you, and enjoy using your Stampin' Cut and Emboss machine. Thanks for joining me. This is Jackie. Bye-bye.